afternoon. The title of this presentation is Sacred Groves Under a Shadow. And it's interesting that this is in the anthropological session. I worked on this research with a number of collaborators. Really excited to present it today. Unfortunately, they couldn't be here. But as you can see from this slide, a lot of their backgrounds are in hard sciences, so forestry, conservation, wildlife science. My own background's in cultural anthropology, social anthropology from SOAS. But it's a really collaborative effort. And so I just want to acknowledge Hamanta Coughley and Sonam Kunso, Bradley Thornton and Julia Worcester, who were heavily involved, and some of them led this research. And this research was conducted, there are two sets of research that I'm going to talk about today. One was conducted in 2015 while I was based at UWISER. It was UWISE at that time, Ugamogchek Institute of Conservation and Environmental Science. Now with an R as well, so research as well. And that was primarily in the Tong Valley. And then the second research that we'll look at today was conducted by UWISER on sacred groves in Ora in 2010, and that was primarily done by Sonam Kunso. So to begin, I'll do a quick sketch of the significance of forests in Bhutan, focusing on why Bhutan is unique, and a lot of this probably won't be surprising to any of you. But looking at two broad categories here, environmental and socio-political. First, looking at topography, since Bhutan is a high altitude country, ecosystems have large national and regional impacts on resources. And you know, a lot of us are probably familiar with Tibet being framed as the third pole, so the idea that high altitude freshwater reserves have a lot of effect downstream. And it can be vital to manage stormwater. So forests can be vital to manage stormwater, reduce flooding, improve water quality elsewhere in the region. And it's also important in high altitude terrain, such as Bhutan, to have a forest play a role with where natural disasters can sometimes have disproportionate impacts. So it's something we saw in Nepal in the Langtang region in 2015. Bhutan is a biodiversity hotspot due to species and ecosystems with rare and endangered plants. And so that can include, for example, the takin, golden langur, snow leopard, red panda, etc. It has one of the highest forest covers of the world. Again, not something surprising probably to many of you, but 71% of the country is currently under forest cover. And just to give you kind of a regional fact, Nepal is somewhere between, right now, 24 to 34%, depending on what statistics you use. So you can see that that's, I mean, a drastic difference. And to highlight that, I've added in a whole bunch of photos to this mostly that I took when I was living in Bhutan. But you can see the top right is a photo I took in the Tong Valley. Bottom left is a photo I took in Nepal. So you can just see the difference, obviously extreme, but deforestation in the region has major impacts. And then moving on to look at socio-political, you know, we know that it's been politically recognized in Bhutan. The G&H pillar support forestry practices via the environmental conservation pillar. In 2008, you know, with the Constitution, there was actually a mandate that at least 60% of forest cover should remain in the country. You know, I mean, how many countries do you know that have that written into the Constitution? It's very unique. Of course, the basics of quality of life, you know, just that air and water quality and recreational activities are, you know, they involve forests, and forests are necessary for that. And so, in the region, we know that Bhutan has significantly higher quality water and air quality than some of the other countries neighboring. And I speak from having also lived in Kathmandu. So those of you who've been there, probably familiar with the difference. And then last but not least, forests are essential for the people living in the rural areas of Bhutan, and this is really what I want to focus on, is rural livelihoods. According to the results of the census that was conducted in Bhutan in 2012, rural people made up 62.2% of the population, so quite a bit. And I know that it's been discussed a few times, and a lot of us have it on our mind, of the kind of issues that come with the rural to urban migration movements that we've been seeing. And so demographic patterns are a real focus right now. of people looking forward in terms of future trends and issues that may come from them. So it's also important to point out that like many places in the world, the majority of the poverty in Bhutan is also concentrated in rural areas. So from a social justice standpoint, it's important to have a better understanding of sort of access to natural resources. And due to their lifestyles, rural people in particular rely on forests, not only for timber, for cooking and heating, but also the non-timber or non-wood forest products, which are very, very important to them. For activities ranging from, religious purposes to traditional medicine to actual food. So the research goals here were to better understand how natural resource management regimes function as they're currently practiced in Bhutan, to examine explicit and implicit forest conservation practices that are already in use by rural communities, and to make recommendations to support future research and policies to bolster conservation efforts and rural livelihood needs. And so sometimes you can see depending what literature you read, conservation efforts can be put in tension with sort of rural livelihood needs. It doesn't necessarily need to exist, but management practices are essential to sort of sort through those two priorities. So in Bhutan right now, there's a number of forest conservation strategies, and this is where we're getting to eventually talking about sacred groves. Protected areas make up right now 51% of forest land. So these are protected areas protected by the national government, and they can include wildlife refuges as well as national parks, of which there are 5. So it's important to point out that designated biological corridors exist in Bhutan. Compared to many countries, Bhutan has sort of a comprehensive organized strategies for retaining species diversity. Really, it's very unique that way. A lot of countries don't have that sort of organized planning to kind of create those corridors. It's also important to point out that there are studies being done right now on the interaction between protected areas and rural communities in terms of access to resources. So looking at how do restrictions impact livelihoods specifically in these areas. I won't give you a whole history of the sort of background of the nationalizing forests in Bhutan, but previously they were managed privately, and then in 1969 there was a Forest Act and the government kind of nationalized all forests. Even today, only 1% of forests in Bhutan are held privately. So you can make a huge impact through policy in Bhutan. I guess that's what I'm getting at. Community forestry was a movement that began after changes in the government policies in 1995 and have grown since then. By definition, the area of government reserve forests are designated for management by a local community. And these were created to provide for the livelihood needs of rural people. So in 2016, there were 677 community forests and growing rapidly. So this is a huge movement. That would encompass 33% of the rural population. And the nice part about community forests is they're supposed to allow communities to manage these autonomously, and they can generate income through selling excess timber and non-timber products, whereas before rural communities were only allowed per permit to take and to use and not to use excess and not to sell. So the idea is you kind of get communities together and then they can actually make an income off of this. And it's worth noting that community forests meet all G&H pillars, all 4 of them, just because they're giving local levels of autonomy back to villages that can be actively managed or actively involved in managing their own resources. So they can kind of tie into good governance via sort of democratic structure, sustainable socioeconomic development, and of course preservation of promotional culture and environmental conservation. So studies show that the establishment of community forests have had a positive impact on community livelihoods through increased unity, empowerment, community participation, a lot of things that we would imagine, as well as economic gains. So the third or second listed here strategy is cultural practices. And these could include taboos, specific types of caretaking and cultural performances or practices to protect these areas. So, most of the people sitting in this room know Bhutan has a number of sacred spaces that are tied, for example, to religious events or other things that have occurred with significance, for example, Mimbartso or the Burning Lake in Bhutan, Taksong, which is one of the most famous sites in Bhutan. but then also more local places like Holy Springs, Korji, for example, or Sacred Groves. So the study I want to talk about carried out research in 3 different locations, 2 in the Tong Valley near Oguncholing, and 1 in Dorr. They had variations, these community forests had variations of walking times to the forest. And you can see on the map, those are where the 2 sites were. And they also had variations in the age of the community forest, had been in existence between 4 and 13 years. The aim of the research was twofold: to look at the successes and failures of this management strategy from both environmental and sociocultural viewpoints. Specifically to look at villagers' satisfaction with the scheme or issues with it, as well as biodiversity conservation. Does it actually protect the forest, and are villagers happy with the arrangement? So to do this, you can see there's a picture from the research. We conducted semi-structured interviews and key informant interviews to assess the current status of management practices. In those 3 areas, 80 out of 115 households were surveyed, so pretty good number actually. We had, at the time, thought that it was really ambitious, but it ended up happening. So namely, the respondents were farmers, 70% or more in each community, so we're talking very agrarian. However, residents in Dorr, and for those of you that are familiar with Dorr, were also nomadic yak herders. It's kind of a nomadic village. So communities had main livelihood strategies that included selling potatoes, collecting cordyceps, and then a number of other kind of yak herding, again, mostly in Dorr, mushrooms, dairy, fodder, bamboo baskets. And again, I'm just kind of painting that to, again, talk a little bit about the relationship between, when we think about rural livelihoods, there's a lot of ways that people are using the forest. And questions were asked regarding local community forest usage, including usefulness, management, and issues with forest governance. The respondents were also asked to identify native plants and their usefulness in order to demonstrate engagement with biodiversity. Results were, and the kind of most interesting findings here, were majority of respondents, 100% in one of the forests in each group said that they believed that the community forest structure were better than the previous setup with government forests, which was an interesting finding. So in general, people are pretty happy with the community forest setup. 2 groups said they spent less or significantly less time collecting resources. Shambayang, one of the forests again, was at 100%. One of the groups reported spending more time collecting resources, that was Dorr, and I'll talk about that in a second. And based on the survey data, respondents claimed that the wildlife present in the community forest had either stayed the same or increased within the last 10 years. Also kind of a positive finding. And then in terms of the conclusions from this study was access was important. We think that in Dorr, part of the issue was that they couldn't access the community forest because the road didn't reach. Community buy-in is needed for satisfaction and governance. And there was a need to prioritize the utility of non-timber forest products to manage tensions between conservation and use. So we had an interesting finding with wild rose in the forest because there was a tension between villagers wanting to keep these wild rose shrubs in the forest because Jili namchu, which is a mushroom, grows on the wild rose and they use that for medicinal purposes. However, foresters wanted them to manage against wild rose bushes because they can be detrimental to tree growth. So that little situation, you could see that there's a tension between, again, what the villagers might want and also what the foresters have an interest in. And so there needs to be sort of discussion between those two in terms of the trade-offs and priorities. Also, the age of the community forest may matter. The respondents who had reported the highest satisfaction with the forest were those who had the oldest one. So the ones with the newer forest in Dorr either didn't understand the rules of the forest or they didn't really know the management plan. In terms of species conservation, each group cited a positive impact of the community forest on species conservation. How am I doing, John? Okay. Okay. And then, moving on now to sacred groves, which I know all of you probably really want to hear about. So in terms of this research study, which was conducted by Weiser in 2010, we'll look more closely at the connection between natural resource management and spiritual practices. I have a cultural anthropology background, so I could go on about sacred probably for the whole presentation, but to kind of minimize time, I just took the definition from the Oxford English Dictionary, which defines sacred as connected with God or a god or dedicated to a religious purpose and so deserving veneration, or regarded as too valuable to be interfered with. So in recent decades, there's an increasing emphasis in academic literature of the role that sacred natural sites play in biodiversity conservation and the kind of link between the two. And at these sites, you see like an integration between spiritual and cultural beliefs and then place-based traditions. In Bhutan, sacred could relate to Buddhism, as we often see with sacred natural sites, again, Taksang and some of these, and then also to local traditions. And villages can have birth and village deities that are also pre-Buddhist. And I know that we've heard that mentioned a couple of times during this conference. So as Riki Krenz writes in Meeting the Other, just wanted to highlight, she says, the Bhutanese farmer sees deities everywhere, and the farmer is part of the environment. Here she does not look upon the land as a commodity as he or she wishes. There are strict rules about placating the deities that inhabit the land, river, air, and rocks. So just this sort of engagement spiritually with the natural surroundings is loaded with many, many meanings. So this study took place in Ora, in looking at two different villages there. I just marked Ora for you, but one is on one side of the, and on one side closer to Jakar, and the other one is on the other side closer to Chumsingla National Park. The east-west highway you can see in the yellow runs through both. So one village is Doshi, which is sort of more developed compared to other villages in the Gayag, and the other one is Shinir, which is traditionally was less connected, but once the highway passed through the village, villagers began to grow more crops. The highway is important, by the way, because of the growth. So in this study, researchers conducted, again, semi-structured interviews, open-ended discussions, mostly with local leaders, elders, and community members, but they made special efforts to speak to younger generations. More difficult, because a lot of younger generations had, again, not surprisingly, left. So in terms of, I just made this little chart to make it obvious, in terms of the findings here, you can see that number of households is basically doubled in Doshi, but and percentage of family members outside the village, again, is more than doubled in Doshi. But number of sacred groves in Shinir was 4, and 2 in Doshi. They both have local deities, again, that protect. So the purpose of the deities is, again, very similar, sort of weather, illness, protecting the villages from storms, frosts, epidemics. They both have prohibitions on either entering the forest or on collecting certain products within the forest. There are permitted exceptions in both cases. In Shinir, the prohibitions can be suspended to search for lost cattle, provided the person is not defiled, which means they're associated with a newborn or they're associated with death in some way. In Doshi, can be an exception would be for the purpose of community sustenance, so to repair a monastery or for other religious reasons, but again, special ceremonies have to be done before that can happen. Elderly members of both villages discussed consequences of violation. So typically it was huge weather issues, so hailstorms, windstorms, heavy rainfall. Some elders in Shinir talked about a forest fire that had damaged trees and then caused an epidemic that caused a lot of death in the village. They still had very poignant memories of this epidemic that killed both animals and people. In Joshi, again, similarly, sort of disability, illness, weather, but a large frost which covered the whole region, which was due to issues in sacred grove. In both villages, they protect the sacred grove through different types of offerings on specific days in a month. And all rituals and offerings by individual households were required. Okay, I'm just going to move on to the conclusion. So, in conclusion, villages had strong spiritual relationships with the groves. While both villages had the east-west highway passed through the groves, those in Shinir were more concerned with the outsider's influence. It could be because those in Doshi were closer to the national park, and because, as I mentioned, they had more administrative sort of influence in the region, they were interacting a lot more with forestry officials, so they had some sort of informal, or maybe even more formalized sort of relationship that allowed them to feel the grove was protected even though outsiders were coming in. Changing traditions is an issue and a concern generationally, as younger generations are schooled elsewhere. And quickly, summary and recommendations for future policy work. So essentially, many conservation strategies already exist for forestry conservation, and new ones have been successfully introduced. For example, the formal legal version of community forestry, which was introduced kind of mostly in the mid-90s and has really taken off. Some may need potentially policy coverage in coming years. So example, sacred groves. If people are moving out of villages, this migration is happening, this generational change, there may be need for legal representation for the sacred groves, depending on the ability of the community to protect it in coming years. In relation to the community forests, we would recommend that regular studies be done to monitor usefulness and satisfaction of the village population and the biodiversity. There's a need for this to be responsive to the population and adaptable with it, especially to meet changes in demographic structure. And last but not least, in terms of sacred groves, one thing that would maybe recommend would be conducting additional studies to look at the role forests play specifically in water conservation, because that's such an economic opportunity in Bhutan. So once you can link something to that, you can also get a lot of support for it. Policy framework, again, about legal protection, because right now there isn't anything legally, formally, to protect sacred groves. But then to do that, we would suggest that you have to really kind of carry out a nationwide survey of sacred forests, which brings up issues of knowing where those are, charting them, and possibly mapping them. But just want to point out that interesting research has been done in 2016 through the International Center for Integrated Mountain Development, ISBS, out of Nepal in the Kailas area, to conceptualize and look at specifically at cultural ecological systems, which is one of the 4 pillars that through the UN for ecological system and services assessments. And the idea was that they did field work and they conducted a study and went and talked to villagers and did interviews about specifically what was essential to those villages. So we would recommend or suggest that similar field work could be carried out in Bhutan, even though it's a huge undertaking. And essentially what this would be doing would be to initiate and try to form a framework to assess cultural ecosystem services, which would be looking at spiritual values, cultural identity, heritage values, and sort of what the local villages are valuing and how that relates to their livelihood systems. Thank you.